Are you the last one here?
Imagine this. You're working late. The sun has long since set, and the familiar, bustling sounds of your workplace have faded into an oppressive silence. The building you know so well during the day transforms. The hallways stretch longer. The shadows deepen, and every familiar creak and hum becomes a question. Today, we are going to share 4 true, unsettling stories from people who discovered that when you work the night shift alone, you are never, ever, truly alone. It's a fear every late-night worker knows intimately. The feeling that the empty building is alive, that it's watching you. It's the paranoia that settles in when you hear a sound you can't explain. Footsteps from a sealed-off exhibit. A whisper from a radio that's turned off. A machine that starts by itself. You tell yourself it's just the building settling, that you're just tired. But the deep, primal fear remains. The terrifying vulnerability of being a single, solitary soul in a vast, dark, and silent space. But what if those sounds aren't just in your head? What if that feeling of being watched is real? By exploring these true, chilling accounts, from a museum guard to a factory worker, we will validate that fear. These stories are the proof that sometimes the things that go bump in the night are not just the pipes, but a real and terrifying presence that shares the quiet, dark hours with you. Now, before we clock in for the graveyard shift, make sure you are subscribed to Whisper Fear and have activated the bell. You don't want to be the one left alone when the real shift begins.
Can you hear the drums?
Our first story is about the weight of history. It's about the profound, oppressive silence of a museum after dark, and the terrifying realization that the past is never truly dead. It comes from a man named Arthur, a night guard who learned that the most chilling exhibits are not the ones behind glass, but the ones that whisper to you from a sealed room, a room that, according to every blueprint and every record, is supposed to be completely and utterly empty. At 63, Arthur's life was a quiet study in duty and routine. He was a man who had been built and then broken by the city of Richmond, Virginia. He had spent 40 years of his life as a skilled iron worker, a proud union man who had helped raise the city's modern skyline. But the years of hard labor had taken their toll. His body a roadmap of aches and old injuries. A fall from a scaffold 5 years prior had ended his career, leaving him with a permanent limp and a quiet, gnawing sense of uselessness. His wife, Mary, was his entire world, but her own battle with a failing heart meant a mountain of medical bills from the VCU, medical center that his meager pension couldn't touch. So he had taken this job. Night security guard at the American Civil War Museum. It wasn't just a job for him. It was a pilgrimage. He was a history buff, a man who found a strange comfort in the silent, ordered narratives of the past. The museum, with its main building on Tredegar Street overlooking the James River, and its historic annex, the White House of the Confederacy, a few blocks away, was his kingdom. His shift, from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., was a solitary 8-hour walk through the silent, sleeping heart of American history. He loved the quiet, the reverence. He felt like a guardian, a silent monk watching over the sacred relics of a nation's most profound trauma. His routine was a well-worn path. He would do his first patrol, checking every door, every window. He knew the building's secrets. The floorboard that always creaked on the second floor. The temperamental hum of the climate control system in the main gallery. The way the moonlight would hit the polished brass of a cavalry saber and make it gleam like a star in the darkness. He was a man who listened to the silence. He was a man who believed he knew every sound his kingdom could make. The new exhibit was the source of a quiet, professional pride for him. It was a special installation on loan from the Smithsonian, titled The Silent Fields, Voices of the Common Soldier. It was housed in a section of the historic White House of the Confederacy building that had been sealed off for decades, a series of small back rooms that had once been used for storage. The museum's curators had spent a year renovating the space, but one room, at the very back of the exhibit, had remained sealed. The plans had called for it to be a small, interactive audiovisual space, but budget cuts and strange, persistent structural issues, dampness, cold spots had forced them to abandon the plan. The lead curator had made the final call. Just wall it off. It's a dead space. We'll pretend it's not there. And so they had. A new, seamless wall of drywall was erected, painted a tasteful museum gray, completely sealing the small, forgotten room from the rest of the building. The rest of the exhibit was a masterpiece of modern museum design. Glass cases filled with letters and diaries, lifelike mannequins in authentic, tattered uniforms, and low, directional speakers that played faint ambient sounds of a crackling campfire or the distant thunder of artillery. It was a beautiful, somber, and deeply moving tribute. The sound started on the third night after the exhibit opened to the public. Arthur was on his 2 a.m. patrol, his footsteps a soft, rhythmic echo on the polished hardwood floors. He was walking through the new exhibit, his flashlight beam playing over the silent, sleeping faces of the mannequins. The ambient sounds were off for the night. The exhibit was supposed to be completely silent. That's when he heard it, a faint sound coming from the new, seamless wall at the back of the exhibit. The wall that sealed off the forgotten room. It was the sound of footsteps. Not his own, echoing back at him, but the sound of multiple footsteps. A slow, heavy, shuffling sound, like a group of exhausted men walking on a dirt floor. He froze, his flashlight beam fixed on the blank gray wall. He listened, his heart beginning a slow, heavy beat. The shuffling continued for a few seconds, then faded into silence. He dismissed it. The building was old. The acoustics were strange. It was probably a sound carrying from another part of the building, from the street, from the pipes. It was a logical, comforting explanation. The next night, it happened again. Same time, same place. The same slow, shuffling footsteps, seeming to pace back and forth, just on the other side of the thin, plasterboard wall. This time, it was accompanied by a new sound. A low, muffled murmuring. It was the sound of voices. Too faint to make out any words, but it was undeniably the sound of a group of men, talking in low, hushed tones. A cold, professional unease began to settle over him. He checked the security cameras. The feed for the exhibit showed only the still, silent room. He did a full patrol of the building, checking every door, every window. Everything was locked, secure. He even went outside, his flashlight beam cutting through the damp, misty Richmond night, and examined the exterior wall of the abandoned room. It was solid brick, with no windows, no doors, no point of entry. He was a man of facts, of tangible evidence, and the facts were telling him that he was hearing a sound that had no source, a conversation that had no speakers. He didn't report it. How could he? He was a 63-year-old man with a history of on-the-job injuries. The last thing he needed was for his supervisors at Allied Universal Security to think he was losing his mind. Hearing things. He needed this job. His family's future depended on it. So he kept his terrifying secret to himself. The museum's silent, watchful guardian now had a secret of his own. The nightly sounds became his private, maddening ritual. Every night around 2 a.m., the shuffling footsteps and the muffled, masculine murmuring would begin, emanating from the sealed room. He tried to ignore it. He tried to cover the sound with his own, humming old Union songs as he walked his patrol. But the sounds from the wall seemed to cut through everything, a quiet, persistent, and terrifying violation of the museum's sacred silence. He began to lose sleep. The sounds would follow him home, echoing in the quiet of his own mind. He became jumpy, irritable. Mary, his wife, noticed. She'd say, her kind eyes full of a worry that he couldn't soothe. "You seem a million miles away, Arthur. Is everything all right at work?" He would just nod, a brittle, unconvincing smile on his face. "Everything's fine, honey. Just tired." One night, driven by a desperate need to understand, to find a logical explanation, he did something he was not supposed to do. He went to the museum's archives during the day, on his day off. He told the daytime curator he was doing some personal research. He pulled the original blueprints for the historic building from 1818. He spent hours poring over the old, brittle pages. He found the section of the building where the exhibit was, and he found the room. The small, forgotten room. At the back, it was not a storage room. According to the original plans, it had been a small private study, a part of the original mansion's living quarters, but it was the architect's notes in the margin that made his blood run cold. The note, written in a faded, spidery script, read, "An acoustic anomaly has been noted in this chamber. Due to the unique, concave curvature of the plasterwork and its position relative to the main house's speaking tube system, the room appears to function as a natural passive audio amplifier. Conversations held in the main parlor and the servants' quarters below are, at times, faintly but clearly audible within this space. Recommend additional insulation to mitigate. A speaking tube system. An acoustic amplifier. It was an explanation. A logical, historical, and deeply, profoundly terrifying explanation. The sounds he was hearing weren't ghosts. They were real. They were the faint residual echoes of conversations that had happened in this house 160 years ago, preserved and amplified by the strange, accidental architecture of this forgotten room. The house itself was a giant primitive recording device, and the sealed room was the speaker. But this new knowledge was not a comfort. It was a new kind of horror. The muffled voices, the shuffling footsteps, they were not the sounds of a modern prank. They were the sounds of the Civil War. The house had been used as a Confederate hospital during the final, brutal years of the war. The main parlor, the room directly below the sealed study, had been a makeshift surgery ward. The sounds he was hearing every night were the real, auditory ghosts of dying men. The shuffling footsteps of wounded soldiers being carried in. The muffled, pain-filled whispers of the surgeons and nurses. That night, he returned to work a changed man. The museum was no longer a quiet, peaceful sanctuary. It was a tomb that whispered. He stood before the blank, gray wall at the back of the exhibit, his ear pressed against the cold plaster. And when the sounds began at 2 a.m., he did not run. He listened. He listened with the focused, reverent attention of a historian. And for the first time, through the muffle and the hiss of a century of silence, a single, clear, and heartbreaking phrase broke through. It was a young man's voice, weak and with a faint southern drawl. "Tell my mama ... I'm sorry." Tears streamed down Arthur's face. He was not a guard. He was a witness to a private, sacred moment of a death that had happened 160 years ago. The experience should have brought him a sense of peace, of historical closure. But the next night, the haunting changed. Usual ambient sounds of the ghostly ward did not come. Instead, at 2 a.m., he heard a new sound. It was a single voice, clear and close, as if the speaker were standing right on the other side of the wall. It was not the voice of a dying soldier. It was a woman's voice, sharp and filled with a cold, professional authority. As she was speaking to him, the voice said, "We know you can hear us, Mr. Davies. The test is complete. Your services are no longer required. Please exit the simulation." Arthur stumbled back from the wall, his mind a complete and total blank. Davies? Simulation? What was she talking about? The woman's voice was replaced by another, a man's voice, deep and authoritative. Subject is exhibiting signs of cognitive dissonance. He appears to be resisting the exit protocol. Initiate. A system reset. And then, a new sound. A loud, blaring, and utterly modern electronic alarm. The kind you would hear in a submarine or a power plant began to shriek from inside the wall. The floor beneath his feet began to vibrate. He was not listening to the past. He was not a witness to a historical tragedy. He had, somehow, inexplicably, stumbled into a live, ongoing, and very real event. He ran. He fled the exhibit, the sound of the alarm chasing him down the silent, echoing halls of the museum. He burst into his security office and slammed the door, his body trembling. He stared at his bank of security monitors, thought the feed from the exhibit was no longer a still, silent image. The room was bathed in a flashing red light that was pouring out from a source he couldn't see. And then the seamless gray wall at the back of the exhibit, the wall that had been built just a few weeks ago, began to dissolve. It wasn't crumbling, it was pixelating, breaking apart into a million tiny squares of light, like a digital image, being deleted. And behind it, there was not a small, dusty, forgotten room. There was a laboratory, a stark, white, and futuristic laboratory, filled with strange, humming machinery and people in clean white lab coats who were all staring out, their faces masks of calm, professional concern, looking directly at the camera. The final horrifying truth was not that the house was a recorder of the past, Dodd. It was that the house, the museum, his entire world, was a simulation. An incredibly detailed, historically accurate, full immersion simulation. And he was not a security guard. He was the subject. He stared at the monitor, at the image of the scientists in their clean white room, looking out at him. One of them, a woman with a clipboard, looked directly into the camera and spoke, her voice coming through the small speaker of his security console, a voice both intimately close and a million miles away. She said, her voice calm, clear, and utterly devoid of emotion, "Subject Arthur Davies, welcome back. We have a lot to discuss. Please do not be alarmed. The memory wipe is usually quite gentle."
Someone is broadcasting.
Our next story is about the ghosts that live in the static, the voices that hide in the noise between stations. It comes from a man named Hector, a night shift janitor who learned that in the profound, empty silence of a modern skyscraper, the most terrifying sound is not a bump in the night, but a familiar melody from a radio that shouldn't be playing, and a whispered secret from a broadcast that isn't supposed to exist. At 58, Hector's life was a quiet study in invisibility. He was a man who had built a life out of being unnoticed, an immigrant from El Salvador. He had come to Atlanta, Georgia, 30 years prior, chasing the same shimmering and often elusive American dream as millions before him. His life was not the one he had dreamed of, but it was a life he was proud of. He had raised 2 successful daughters, both now grown and with families of their own in the suburbs. He had a small meat house in Chambly that was paid off. But after his wife, Alana, had passed away from cancer 2 years ago, the quiet house had become a tomb of memories, its silence too heavy to bear down. So, he had taken this job, janitor, graveyard shift, from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 5 nights a week, at the towering Bank of America Plaza on North Avenue, the tallest skyscraper in Atlanta. The job was his refuge. The mindless, repetitive tasks, mopping the endless marble floors of the lobby, vacuuming the vast, empty office carpets, wiping down the sterile surfaces of 100 different break rooms, were a form of meditation. He was a ghost in a glass and steel cathedral, a silent custodian of a world that only existed in the daylight. He was alone, but he was not lonely. He had his work, and he had his radio. It was an old, beat-up yellow Sony portable radio, a relic from the 90s that he had owned for over 20 years. It was covered in paint splatters and small dings. A testament to a long life of service. It sat on the top shelf of his rolling cleaning cart, his one constant, faithful companion. Every night, he would tune it to a low-volume classic rock station, 97.1, The River, the familiar songs of his youth. A comforting, nostalgic soundtrack to his solitary work. For a year, his routine was a perfect, predictable, and peaceful waltz. He and his radio, two old ghosts gliding through the silent, sleeping building. The first anomaly, the first sour note in his quiet symphony, was so small he almost didn't notice it. He was on the 34th floor, the offices of a high-powered law firm, around 2 a.m. The radio was playing a familiar Tom Petty song. He was mopping the floor of the break room when the music suddenly cut out, replaced by a loud burst of hissing, crackling static. He sighed, annoyed. The reception was always a little spotty on the higher floors. He walked over to the cart and was about to adjust the tuning knob when, just as suddenly as it had started, the static cut out and the familiar strains of the Tom Petty song returned. As if nothing had happened. A simple, logical explanation. A momentary signal interruption. He thought nothing more of it. But it happened again the next night. And the night after that. Always on the higher floors. Always around the same time. The radio would be playing perfectly, and then for a minute or two, it would dissolve into a loud, aggressive static before returning to normal. It was an annoyance, but a predictable one. He began to think of it as just another one of the building's many quirks. A week later, the nature of the anomaly changed. He was on the 42nd floor, a financial services company. The radio cut to static as he now expected it to. But this time, the static was different. It wasn't just a random, chaotic hiss. Underneath the noise, there was something else. A pattern. A faint, rhythmic sound, a soft, almost inaudible whisper. He stopped his work and leaned closer to the small, tinny speaker, his ear pressed against the plastic grill. The sound was too faint, too buried in the noise to make out any words. It was like hearing a conversation from a great distance. The words swallowed by the wind. It lasted for about a minute. Then the static cleared, and a cheerful commercial for a local car dealership filled the air. A cold, unfamiliar feeling began to settle in his gut. This was not a signal interruption. This was a signal of something else. The whispers in the static became a nightly occurrence. He began to anticipate them, a knot of dread and a strange, compelling curiosity tightening in his stomach as his elevator ascended into the upper floors. He tried to record the sound on his phone, but the phone's microphone only picked up the loud, overwhelming hiss of the static. The whispers, it seemed, were a secret meant only for the old analog ears of his Sony radio. He began to feel a sense of unease in the building. The familiar, empty corridors now felt watchful. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was a listening silence. He started to feel, for the first time in his life, a real creeping paranoia. Was he losing his mind? Was he, a 58-year-old man, finally succumbing to the profound, cumulative loneliness of his life? He had to know. He had to find a logical explanation. He, like the other subjects of our stories, began his own quiet investigation. The next time the whispers started, he didn't just listen. He acted. He grabbed the radio and began to walk around the floor, holding it up like a divining rod, searching for a spot where the signal, the whisper, was stronger. He found it in a corner office, a large, luxurious space with a panoramic view of the glittering, sleeping city. As he moved closer to the large, plate glass window, the static on the radio grew louder, the whispers underneath more defined, almost intelligible. He stood there, by the window, 42 stories above the city of Atlanta, and listened. The whispers were still too distorted to understand, but he could now clearly make out the cadence of speech, the rise and fall of a human voice. A ghost on the airwaves. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The static vanished, and the radio switched, not back to the classic rock station, but to a different station, one he had never heard before. It was playing a song, a simple, haunting, and impossibly familiar melody. It was an old folk song from his village in El Salvador, a song his own mother used to sing to him as a child, a song he hadn't heard in over 40 years. He stood there in the dark, silent office, the sweet, heartbreaking melody of his own long-buried childhood filling the air, and he began to weep. The tears were not of sadness, but of a profound and terrifying confusion. This was not a coincidence. This was not a random radio signal. This was a message that was aimed directly at him. The song played to its end and was replaced by a soft, hissing static. And then, a new sound came from the speaker. A voice. It was not singing. It was a whisper, a dry, cold, and inhuman-sounding whisper. And it was speaking in perfect, unaccented Spanish, a language he had not heard on the radio since he was a boy. And the voice said, "We know you are listening, Hector." He dropped the radio. It hit the plush carpet with a soft thud, the voice from the speaker still whispering, "We know about your daughters. We know about Elena. We know about the quiet, sad life you have made for yourself in this empty glass box." He stumbled back, his body trembling, his mind a complete and total blank of pure, undiluted terror. It knew his name. It knew his wife's name. It knew everything. He fled the office, leaving the whispering radio behind on the floor. He ran to the elevator, his heart a wild, frantic bird in his chest. He rode the elevator down to the lobby, the silence of the car a suffocating presence. He didn't clock out. He didn't get his things. He just ran out of the building into the cold pre-dawn air of the city, and he never went back. The story should have ended there. A terrified man, a haunted building, an inexplicable, terrifying event. But Hector was a man of quiet courage, and he was a man who needed answers. He spent the next week in a state of paranoid, sleepless dread. He couldn't eat. He couldn't rest. The whispers from the radio had followed him home, a constant looping echo in his own mind. He had to know. He did something incredibly brave and incredibly foolish. He went back, not to work, but to investigate. He waited until a Saturday night, when he knew the building would be at its most empty. He used his old employee key card, which he had not returned, to get into the building's underground parking garage. He took the service elevator, not to the 42nd floor, but to the 55th, the top floor. The 55th floor was not like the others. It was an unleased, unfinished space, a vast concrete cavern filled with construction materials, exposed wiring, and the ghosts of the building's own creation. And it was from here, he reasoned, that a powerful, illegal radio signal could be broadcast without being easily detected. He walked through the dark, cavernous space, his flashlight beam a small, nervous circle in the immense darkness. The air was cold and smelled of raw concrete and ozone. And it was from the far corner of this vast, empty floor that he heard. The faint, unmistakable sound of his own past. The sound of the Salvadoran folk song being played softly on a radio. He followed the sound, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He found a small, windowless room, a utility closet that had been converted into something else. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open. The room was a small, makeshift radio broadcasting studio. It was filled with high-end, professional equipment, mixers, microphones, a powerful transmitter. And in the center of the room, sitting in a worn-out office chair, his back to the door, was a man. He was wearing headphones, and he was humming along to the soft, sad melody of Hector's childhood. It was not a ghost. It was not a demon. It was a person. As Hector stood there, frozen in the doorway, The man in the chair slowly swiveled around. He was a young man, maybe in his early 20s, with a pale, thin face and the wide, obsessive eyes of a true believer. He smiled when he saw Hector Dodd. It was not a friendly smile. It was a smile of validation, of triumph. The young man said, his voice the same cold, neutral voice from the radio. "Hector, I was wondering when you would finally come and find me," Hector whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Who are you?" The young man said, his smile widening, "I'm a fan. I'm a fan of all of you. The night people, the ghosts who keep this city running, while everyone else is asleep. The security guards, the cleaners, the lonely souls. I watch you all on the city's security feeds. It's so easy. A little bit of hacking, a little bit of social engineering. I know all your stories," he gestured. "Around the room. This is my studio, my art project. I find a lonely soul like you. I learn their story, their fears, their sorrows. And then I create a broadcast just for them. A little play, a little ghost story to make them feel a little less alone. The final, horrifying, and deeply human truth of the whispers, of the song, of the voice that knew his name, crashed down on Hector Dodd. This wasn't a haunting. It was a performance, a cruel, elaborate, and psychologically devastating piece of performance art, with him as the unwilling star. Hector whispered, his body trembling with a mixture of terror and a profound, righteous rage. "You are a monster." The young man's smile faded. He said, his voice suddenly cold, "Empty. No, I'm not the monster. I'm just the one with the radio. The real monsters. They're the ones who build these empty glass boxes and leave lonely old men inside them to die with nothing but the ghosts of their own memories for company." He stood up. "But the show is over, Hector. The broadcast is finished, and now, I'm afraid, we have a loose end." He reached under the console and pulled out a long, thin, metal tire iron. Hector was never seen again. He simply vanished. Another ghost in a city full of them. But the young man in the studio, the artist, the fan, he is still out there. And he is still broadcasting. And every night, in the high, lonely, and forgotten floors of the city's skyscrapers, another lonely soul, another night guard, another janitor, turns on their old, beat-up radio, hoping for a familiar song to keep them company in the dark. And sometimes, if they are unlucky, if they are chosen, they will hear a new station, a new song, a broadcast meant just for them, a final, terrifying, and deeply personal performance. A story that always, always ends in silence.
It's not my time.
Our third story is about the quiet, sterile horror of a place where life is not supposed to exist. It's about the profound, absolute silence of a hospital morgue after midnight. It comes from a young man named Leo, a hospital technician who learned that the most terrifying secrets are not kept by the living, but by the dead. And that sometimes the thing you find in a refrigerated drawer is not a body, but a story that can get you killed. At 25, Leo's life was a study in exhaustion. He was a man running on a treadmill of debt, a quiet, unassuming casualty of the American dream. His mother's long, losing battle with cancer had left his family emotionally and financially shattered. Now, with his father working 2 jobs just to stay afloat, Leo had put his own dreams of a degree in forensic science on hold. He had taken a job at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland, not as a scientist, but as a night shift lab technician. His life was a quiet, lonely cycle of processing blood samples, running tests, and trying to stay awake under the harsh, fluorescent lights of the sub-basement laboratory. The graveyard shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. was a lonely, isolating world, but the pay was better. Every dollar was a small victory against the mountain of medical bills his mother had left behind. He was a good technician. Precise, reliable, and invisible. He understood the unspoken rules of the night shift. You keep to yourself. You do your job, and you don't ask questions. The hospital after dark was a different entity than the bustling, life-saving machine of the daytime. At night, it was a quiet, sleeping giant. Its long, sterile corridors filled with a profound, listening silence. It was a world of hushed whispers, of soft, rubber-soled footsteps, and the distant, rhythmic beeping of machines that were the only heartbeats in the building. The task that would unravel his world was a mundane one. It was a Tuesday, just after 3 a.m. The hospital was in its deepest state of slumber. A frantic call had come down from the surgical IQ. A new patient, a John Doe from a multi-car pileup on I-83, was being prepped for emergency surgery. They needed his original intake files, the physical paperwork that had been sent down to central records for processing hours earlier. It was a simple, bureaucratic errand, a common occurrence in the chaotic world of emergency medicine. The central records office was located in the sub-basement, a vast climate-controlled labyrinth of rolling shelves, just on the other side of the hospital morgue. Leo's path was a familiar one, but one he always dreaded. To get to records, he had to take the old, rattling service elevator down one more level and walk the long, cold, concrete corridor that connected the labs to the morgue. The air always grew colder on this level, the scent of antiseptic giving way to something older, colder, a smell of refrigerated air, and a faint, cloying sweetness that he tried his best to ignore. He took the elevator down, the old machine groaning in protest. The doors opened onto the silent, concrete hallway. The only sound was the low, persistent hum of the massive refrigeration units on the other side of the morgue's heavy steel doors. He walked down the hall, his footsteps echoing in the silence, his breath a small cloud in the cold air. He reached the records office, a simple, windowless room with a single, heavy metal door. He swiped his key card, the lock clicking open with a loud, electronic beep. He went inside, the rows of gray, metal filing cabinets standing like silent metal soldiers. He found the file for the John Doe easily. It was a thin, simple folder, the story of a life reduced to a few typed pages. He was about to leave when he noticed it. The main door to the morgue, a heavy, soundproof steel door that was always kept shut and locked, was slightly ajar. A thin, vertical sliver of the cold, sterile, and brightly lit interior was visible. His first thought was that a pathologist or a transport attendant was inside, but he hadn't heard the elevator. He hadn't heard any other footsteps. He stood in the silent hallway, listening. He heard nothing but the hum of the compressors. A cold, professional curiosity, the part of him that wanted to be a forensic scientist, took over. He pushed the heavy door open a few more inches and peered inside. The morgue was a place of absolute clinical order. The floor was clean, white tile. The walls were stainless steel. The air was frigid. On one side of the room was a series of gurneys, all empty. On the other side, the wall was a bank of refrigerated body storage units, a grid of 60 identical stainless steel doors, each with a small numbered plaque. It was a silent, sterile, and profoundly final room. And it was empty. He was about to back out, to close the door and forget what he had seen, when his eyes caught on something that was wrong. It was a small detail, an imperfection in the perfect, geometric order of the room. One of the refrigerated unit doors, number 14, was not completely closed. It was ajar, by no more than a half an inch, a tiny, dark gap in the gleaming wall of steel. He stared at it, a new, colder kind of fear beginning to creep up his spine. His training, his protocol, was clear. Do not touch anything. Go back upstairs, call security, and report it. It was the safe. Logical thing to do. But it was 3:30 in the morning. A call like that would trigger a full-blown incident report. Thought it would mean paperwork, questions, and the unwelcome attention of his supervisors. He was the new guy on the night shift, the kid trying to prove himself. The last thing he wanted was to be seen as the guy who panics over a loose latch. He told himself, his voice a silent whisper in his own mind. It's just a faulty latch. The last attendant didn't shut it properly. I'll just close it. No harm, no foul. He stepped into the cold room, the heavy door swinging shut behind him with a soft, final whoosh. The sound made him jump. He walked over to the wall of steel doors, his reflection a distorted funhouse version of himself. In the polished metal, he reached out a hand and pushed on the door of Unit 14. It swung shut with a soft click, but it didn't latch. A moment later, it swung open again, back to its original half-inch gap. He frowned. Something was obstructing the locking mechanism. He would have to open it a little wider, just to see. He took a deep, steadying breath, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm. He pulled the heavy, stainless steel handle. The drawer slid out with a smooth, silent, and well-oiled motion. The body inside was covered with a clean, white sheet. He couldn't see the face, just a vague, human shape beneath the cloth. He just needed to pull it out a few inches to see the latch inside. He pulled the gurney out about a foot. He leaned in, his phone's flashlight a small trembling circle of light, and peered into the dark, refrigerated compartment. The latch seemed fine. There was nothing blocking it. And then he saw it. The sheet over the body was moving. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement. The slow, rhythmic rise and fall of a chest. The person under the sheet was breathing. He stumbled back. A choked, silent scream caught in his throat. His mind for a moment simply went blank. A person. A living person. In the morgue. A nightmare scenario. A 1 in a million mistake. Someone had been pronounced dead, and they were not. He was about to slam the drawer shut and run for the panic button on the wall when his eyes fell on the chart. Clipped to the foot of the gurney. It was a standard hospital. Toe tag and a patient summary. He angled his phone's light onto it. The name on the chart was John Doe, number 237. Cause of death, cardiac arrest. Time of death, 3 days ago. His blood ran cold. This was not a fresh arrival. This was a body that had been in cold storage for 72 hours. No one could survive that. And there was another detail. A small, red, biohazard sticker on the chart. The patient had died from a highly infectious, experimental, and quarantine virus he had contracted during a clinical trial at the hospital's research wing. The body should have been incinerated within 24 hours. It shouldn't even be here. This was not a mistake. This was a secret. As his mind reeled with this new, terrifying information, the body on the slab sat up. The sheet fell away. It was not a patient. It was a man thin and gaunt, probably in his 40s, with a pale, sweaty face and wide, terrified eyes. He was wearing standard-issue blue hospital scrubs. He looked at Leo, and his eyes were not the eyes of a dead man. They were the eyes of a man who was in the deepest, most profound trouble of his life. He brought a single trembling finger to his lips. He whispered, his voice a dry, hoarse croak. "Shh, they'll hear you." "Who?" Leo whispered back, his own voice a stranger to his ears. The man pointed a shaky finger at the refrigerated unit directly next to his. "Number 15. The man rasped. "He's in there. The real John Doe. The one with the virus. We switched places. It was the only way." The man scrambled off the gurney and onto the cold, tile floor. He said, his voice growing a little stronger, a little more urgent. "My name is Dr. Reese Thorne. I'm a virologist. I was the head of the clinical trial. The one for the new drug, HEMOVI Rex. It was supposed to be a miracle. A cure. But it's not Dot, it's a poison. It doesn't cure the virus. It accelerates it, and it makes it airborne. He looked at Leo, his eyes burning with a desperate, feverish intensity. The company that owns the drug, a private research firm called Viridian Dynamics, they know. They've known for weeks. But the drug is worth billions, Dot. They buried the data. They started replacing the failed test subjects with anonymous John Does, declaring them dead of other causes and cremating the bodies before anyone could ask any questions. They are covering up a plague. The name Viridian Dynamics sent a jolt of recognition through Leo's memory, a faint echo from a story he had once heard about a job interview and a company that dealt in secrets. Thorne continued, his voice a low, frantic whisper. I was going to go to the press. To the CDC. I had the proof, the original data. They found out. They cornered me in my lab. They drugged me. They declared me dead of a sudden heart attack. I was supposed to be in the incinerator yesterday, but one of the morgue attendants, a good man, he owed me a favor. He helped me switch places with the real John Doe. He left the drawer unlatched so I wouldn't suffocate. He was supposed to come back for me tonight, but he never showed. He reached into the pocket of his scrubs and pulled out a small, encrypted flash drive. He said, pressing it into Leo's hand, it's all here, the real data, the names of the other victims, everything. Dot, you have to get this out. You can't trust anyone in this hospital. Viridian's people are everywhere. Go to the press. Go to the CDC. Dot, just get it out. As he spoke, they both heard it. The soft, distant ding of the service elevator arriving at their level, followed by the sound of the elevator doors opening. Dot, and then footsteps. Dot, the slow, deliberate, confident footsteps of two people walking down the long concrete corridor towards the morgue. Thorne's face went white with a new final terror. He whispered, they're here. They knew he didn't show. They're here to finish the job. He scrambled back onto the gurney and pulled the sheet over himself. He hissed at Leo, close the drawer. Dot, act normal. Forget you ever saw me. Dot, it's the only way. Leo stood there, the flash drive a cold, heavy weight in his hand, his mind a screaming chaos of impossible choices. The footsteps were closer now, just outside the morgue door. He was a lab tech, a kid trying to pay off his mother's medical bills. He was not a hero. He was not a spy. He was just a guy in the wrong place at the worst possible time. He could do what the doctor said. He could close the drawer, hide the flash drive, and walk away. He could pretend none of this had ever happened. He could go back to his quiet, invisible life. Or he could become a part of the story. He could take the flash drive, and in doing so, he would inherit the doctor's secret, his mission, and his enemies. He would become a target. The doorknob to the morgue began to turn. He was out of time. He looked at the gurney, at the still, sheet-covered form of the man who had entrusted him with his life. He looked at the flash drive in his hand, a small plastic object that held a secret that could save thousands of lives or end his own. And he looked at the door as it swung open, revealing the two large, silent men in dark, nondescript suits who were standing in the hallway, their cold, professional eyes fixing on him. The horror wasn't the dead man who was alive. The horror wasn't the impossible secret he now held. The horror was the choice between his own quiet, simple, and safe life and a truth that was so large, so dangerous that it could get him and everyone he loved killed. The two men stepped into the room, the door swinging shut behind them, sealing the three of them in the cold, sterile, and silent morgue. And in that final, terrifying moment, Leo knew that his life, the quiet, invisible life of a night shift janitor, was over, one way or another.
It's time to work.
Our final story is about the ghosts of industry. It's about the vast, empty cathedrals of metal and concrete where things were once made, and where the echoes of a million forgotten shifts still linger in the air. It comes from a man named Frank, a night shift maintenance worker in a factory that was half living, half dead. He learned that the most terrifying sounds are not the groans of a haunted house, but the sudden, impossible roar of a machine that has no power. And that sometimes, the ghost in the machine is not a ghost at all, but a flesh and blood secret that has been living in the darkness, waiting for its turn to speak. At 61, Frank's life was a testament to the quiet dignity of work. He was a man made of grease, steel, and a profound, unshakable loyalty to the city of Detroit. He had spent 40 years of his life on the assembly lines of the Big Three, a proud member of the UAW. He had seen the city rise, and he had watched with a slow, heartbreaking certainty as it fell. The 2008 recession had taken his job, his pension, and a piece of his soul. But Frank was a survivor. He was a man who knew how to fix things. He now worked as the sole night shift maintenance man for a smaller, independent automotive parts manufacturer, Apex Machining, located in a sprawling, aging factory complex just south of Hamtramck. In the shadow of the I-75, his life was a simple, quiet routine. He would come home to his small brick bungalow in a working-class neighborhood, a house he had lived in for 40 years. He would have dinner with his wife, Maria, and then spend a few hours with his grandson, Leo, whose parents both worked late shifts. Leo was his world, a bright, curious 5-year-old boy who was the repository of all his hopes for the future. Then, at 10 p.m., he would drive his old Ford F-150 to the factory, a place he would have all to himself until the morning crew arrived. He didn't mind the solitude. The factory was a familiar beast. He knew its language, the hum of the transformers, the hiss of the pneumatic lines, the rhythmic clank of the conveyor belts. The Apex Machining Factory was a place of two halves. The front section, the new section, was a brightly lit modern facility filled with state-of-the-art CNC machines and robotic arms that worked in a precise, hypnotic ballet. But the back half of the factory, a vast, cavernous space that stretched for a quarter of a mile, was a graveyard. It was the old factory, a relic from the 1950s that had been decommissioned for a decade. The power to this section was cut, the machine silent, shrouded in thick plastic. Tarps standing like forgotten metal dinosaurs in the gloom. It was a dark, silent, and slightly sad place, a museum of a dead industry. Frank's job was to maintain the living half of the factory. His nightly routine was a slow, methodical patrol. He would check the gauges, lubricate the machinery, and listen for any sound that was out of place. He was a doctor, and the factory was his patient. The first impossible sound came on a cold, windy night in January. He was in the new section, performing a routine diagnostic on a robotic welding arm. It was around 2 a.m. The only sound was the hum of the machine and the howl of the wind outside. And then he heard it, a sound from the back of the factory, a loud, metallic clang, followed by the distinct, unmistakable sound of a heavy industrial conveyor belt starting up, its old, rusty chain groaning in protest. He froze, his hand still on the control panel. The sound was coming from the old section, the section with no power. He listened, his heart beginning a slow, heavy beat. The conveyor belt ran for about 30 seconds, its rhythmic, clanking sound a terrible, impossible ghost in the silent factory. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound than before. His first thought was a logical one, a short circuit, a residual charge in an old capacitor, a power surge from the storm outside that had somehow, impossibly, jumped the deadlines. He was an engineer at heart. He believed in explainable phenomena. He put on his heavy work coat, grabbed his most powerful flashlight, and walked to the massive, rolling steel door that separated the new factory from the old. He pulled the heavy door open, its wheels screeching in protest, and stepped into the darkness. He called out, his voice a small, thin sound in the vast, cavernous space. "Hello? Anyone back here?" Only the echo of his own voice answered. He shone his flashlight beam into the darkness. The beam cut through the thick, dusty air, illuminating the shrouded, silent shapes of the dead machines. The air was cold and smelled of old oil and rust. He walked the length of the silent assembly line, his flashlight beam dancing across the tarps. He reached the conveyor belt that he had heard. It was still. He checked the main power switch. It was in the off position, and the heavy, industrial power cable that fed it was unplugged, its thick, snake-like form lying coiled in the dust on the floor. There was no logical explanation. The machine had no power. It could not have turned on. He stood there for a long time, in the dark, in the silence, a profound sense of unease settling over him. He finally returned to the new section, closing the heavy steel door behind him, sealing the mystery back in the darkness. He told himself it was a fluke, a strange one-time event. But it happened again a week later. This time, it wasn't just the conveyor belt. He was making his rounds when he heard a sequence of sounds from the old section. First, the groan of the conveyor belt starting up. Then, a loud, hissing sound, the sound of a pneumatic press. And then, a series of heavy, rhythmic thuds, the sound of an old, industrial stamping machine, a machine that had not been used in over a decade. It was a symphony of impossible sounds. The sounds of the old assembly line, coming back to life, one machine at a time. It was as if a ghost crew had clocked in for their shift. The fear was real now, a cold, hard knot in his stomach. But it was mixed with a powerful, stubborn curiosity. He had to know. He had to understand. He went back to the old section, his flashlight beam a trembling, nervous thing. As he opened the door, the sound stopped. The silence rushed back in, a heavy, waiting thing. He began to spend his nights watching, listening. He would sit in the dark, on a stack of old pallets, just on his side of the steel door, and listen. The sounds would always start around 2 a.m., a different sequence of machines every night, sometimes just one, sometimes a half-dash dozen. It was a chaotic, nonsensical pattern. A ghost in the machine, playing with the dead switches. One night, the pattern changed. It was no longer random. It was a clear, deliberate sequence. First, the conveyor belt, then the press, then the stamper, then a new sound, the high-pitched whine of a cutting tool. It was the exact four-step sequence of a specific part that this factory used to produce, a part that had been discontinued 12 years ago. It wasn't just a haunting. It was a memory. The factory itself was remembering how to work. The fear was now a living, breathing thing. He knew he should report it. But who would believe him? They would think he was old, tired, losing his mind. They would take his job, his last bastion of purpose, away from him. So he kept his terrifying secret. He became the sole, silent witness to the nightly resurrection of a dead assembly line. He decided he needed more than just his ears. He needed eyes. He took a small digital camera from home, a simple point and shoot, and a tripod. He set it up in the old section, its lens aimed down the long, dark assembly line. He set it to time-lapse mode, to take a single photo every 10 seconds for the entire night. The next morning, he retrieved the camera, his hands shaking as he uploaded the thousands of photos to his laptop in the security of his own home. He played the photos back as a video. The footage was a grainy, silent, and deeply unsettling movie. It showed the dark, still factory. The hours ticked by. Then, at 2:17 a.m., a single light on the control panel of the conveyor belt flickered on, then another on the press. Then another on the stamper. The machines themselves did not move, but their lights, their dead, electronic eyes were coming on in sequence. But that wasn't the most terrifying part. As he watched the sped-up footage, he saw it. A flicker of movement at the very edge of the frame. In the deep shadows at the far end of the factory, it was a shape. A small, quick, human-like shape, darting from the shadow of one machine to the next. It was so fast, so blurry, that he couldn't make out any details. But it was there, and it was moving in sync with the lights on the machines. He was not alone in the factory. The ghost in the machine had a ghost of its own. The final, horrifying revelation came from a place he never would have looked. His own family history. He was telling his grandson, Leo, a bedtime story. A story about the factory, about the big, loud machines. Leo asked, his eyes wide, "Did you work there with Grandpa Michael?" Frank froze. His older brother Michael had worked at this factory back in the 80s and 90s. He had been a line foreman, a good man, a proud worker. He had been killed in a tragic accident at the factory 15 years ago. A faulty piece of machinery, a press, had malfunctioned. He had been crushed. It was a wound that his family had never truly recovered from. Frank had taken this job, in part, as a quiet, subconscious way to be close to the last place his brother had been alive. Frank said, his voice thick with a none. Old, familiar grief. "Yeah, buddy. Yeah, Grandpa Michael worked there. Did he teach you the secret whistle?" Leo asked. "The what?" Leo repeated. "The secret whistle. The one the machines sing." And he began to hum a strange, off-key, but rhythmic and mechanical-sounding tune. A tune that was made of the sounds of a conveyor belt, a pneumatic press, and an industrial stamper. The blood drained from Frank's face. Where did you hear that, Leo?" "The new kid at school," Leo said. "His name is Danny. He taught it to me. He said his dad taught it to him. His dad used to work at a factory. A long time ago." The next day, Frank did something he had never done before. He looked up his brother's old employee file. He found the records from the accident investigation. It had been ruled an accident, but there were notes in the margin. Notes about another employee. A young, troubled man named Daniel, who had been a close friend of his brother's, and who had been fired a week after the accident for erratic behavior and insubordination. The man had been a maintenance worker. He knew the factory's systems inside and out, and he had, according to the notes, vanished after he was fired. He found an old photo of his brother's work crew from a company picnic. There was his brother, Michael, young and smiling, and standing next to him, his arm around his brother's shoulder, was a thin, pale young man with the wide, haunted eyes. Daniel, the father of the boy at his grandson's school. The final, horrifying, and deeply human truth of the haunting crashed down on him. The ghost in the factory wasn't his brother. It was a man, driven mad by grief and guilt, who had never left. Daniel had been living in the abandoned section of the factory for 15 years, a ghost in his own life. The sounds he made, the machines he turned on, it wasn't a haunting. It was a ritual, a desperate, nightly reenactment of the last moments of his friend's life. He was trapped in a loop of his own making, a prisoner of a single terrible memory, and the small, fleeting shape he had seen on the camera footage. That had been the man's son, Danny, a little boy who had been born into this strange, secret, and subterranean life. A boy whose only lullaby was the sound of dead machines coming to life in the dark. That night, Frank did not stay in his safe, well-lit section of the factory. He walked through the heavy steel door and into the darkness of the old factory. He did not carry a flashlight. He just walked down the silent assembly line, his footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. He stopped in the center of the factory floor and he waited. At 2:17 a.m., the familiar sequence of sounds began. the groan of the conveyor belt, the hiss of the press. He did not run. He just stood, a silent witness in the dark, and he began to whistle. He whistled the strange mechanical tune his grandson had taught him, the secret whistle of the machines. The sounds of the factory stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. And from the deep, dark shadows at the far end of the factory, a figure emerged. A man, older now, his face a mask of confusion and a dawning, terrible hope. And beside him, holding his hand, was a small, pale boy. They stood there, the three of them, in the silent, sleeping heart of the dead factory. Three ghosts from three different worlds, finally meeting. The horror was not that the factory was haunted by a ghost. The horror was that it was haunted by a life that had been lived in the shadows, a life of profound grief and loneliness, a life that had finally, after 15 long years, been heard. A museum that remembers its own ghosts, a radio that broadcasts a private, curated hell, a morgue where the dead do not rest, and a factory floor that still echoes with the grief of a single, terrible moment. These 4 stories are a testament to a quiet, invisible truth known only to those who work the graveyard shift. When the sun goes down and the rest of the world goes to sleep, the buildings we leave behind do not become empty. They wake up. The true horror of the night shift is not the darkness or the solitude. It is the profound, unnatural silence. A silence so deep it becomes a canvas. And on that canvas, the building itself begins to paint. It uses a palette of creaks and echoes, and the hum of old machinery. The sounds you dismiss during the day as mundane and meaningless become, in the dead of night, a language, a secret, terrifying language that tells the stories of the lives that have been lived and lost within its walls. These accounts force us to see our own world differently. They remind us that the janitors, the security guards, the technicians, a silent, invisible army that keeps our world running while we sleep, are not just workers. They are guardians. They are the unwilling keepers of the secrets that our buildings only tell after everyone else has gone home. And they leave us with a final, chilling question. The next time you walk into a clean, quiet office building in the morning, have you ever stopped to wonder what the person who was there just before you had to listen to all night in the dark? If these stories have given you a new respect for the quiet courage of the night shift worker, prove you are listening by subscribing to Whispered Fear, leaving a like, and sharing this video. Your support helps us to keep watch through the long, dark hours. But what if the horror isn't found in the place you work, but in the small, simple act of your own forgetfulness? A simple mistake that can unravel your entire world. Click the video on your screen. Now for our next collection of cautionary tales. 3 true scary stories of people who forgot something important and what happened next. See you there, if you remember to click.